Always happy to have things recorded, and you should feel free to share this with your board or your colleagues or whoever else you feel would find it of interest. Okay. So just briefly, I'm going to share with you some results from some research we did on the demand for digital skills, and in particular among help wanted ads that were posted for jobs based in Vermont. Talk briefly about some new federal funding that's coming that will complement what you're doing in workforce and economic development, and then share a couple of specific recommendations for taking action. You already know about National Skills Coalition, so I'm going to skip over that. And so you know this, but I'm going to emphasize it again, right? The digital divide is not just about whether people have high-speed internet access or whether they have a computer, although those are really important things, but it's very much also about whether they have the skills. It's about whether they have the skills to do things like look for a job, apply for a job, participate in online learning, right? A huge percentage of community college students these days take at least one online course as part of their community college training, even folks who are in non-credit classes that are more on the career tech ed side than on the academic side. And so having those digital skills is critically important in helping them be able to pursue that upskilling that will help them get those better jobs. We also know that if you care about whether people have access to high-speed internet, turns out if you have better digital skills, you're more likely to get high-speed internet at home, which is kind of a no-brainer, right? And we know that people often enroll in digital skills classes because they want to get a job or they want to get a better job. And so we decided to actually look at, okay, what are employers specifically asking for? So we partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and I'm obligated to tell you that the opinions expressed in this report reflect those of the authors, that's me, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And we looked at 43 million online job ads that were posted during 2021. And on average, each help wanted ad looked for 8 skills. Now, within that 43 million, obviously several 100,000 were Vermont jobs. I will say that if you're curious, you know, we did do some looking at other New England states, in most in-depth so far, Massachusetts. So I don't know to what extent, you know, folks are doing remote work or long commute jobs to other parts of New England. We can talk about that briefly if that's helpful. But when we went through these 43 million help wanted ads, we coded them according to whether the skills they were requiring were definitely digital, likely digital, or not digital. So definitely digital is kind of a no-brainer. It's things like, you know, if the job ad says you must be proficient in Microsoft Excel or must have skills in the Python programming language. Likely digital is stuff like bookkeeping, where yes, you can absolutely still do bookkeeping using pen and paper and a ledger. But most people these days are using QuickBooks or Peachtree or even good old Excel to do bookkeeping. And then there's not digital skills. You can imagine folks in elder care, child care doing tasks like changing diapers and also behavioral skills like problem solving, right? And so these are national numbers. So let's look at Vermont in particular. So the numbers are pretty close in Vermont to the national numbers, just slightly lower than the national average. And part of that is just a reflection of rural communities in general. States with a more rural population are slightly below the national average in terms of the number of job ads requiring digital skills. So that's the kind of big picture piece of the puzzle. And we'll get to some more Vermont specific data in a few minutes. But I just want to kind of illustrate the breadth of everything that we mean when we say digital skills. One thing that really stood out to us when we did this analysis was this is not just industries like finance and insurance or, you know, real estate, where you might think, oh yeah, of course, it's lots of white collar workers sitting at a desk using a computer. It is very much also the case that even in construction, agriculture, accommodation and food services, people are needing to have digital skills. I talked to one construction company. They told me, look, you know, most of our guys have a high school level education. Not all of them speak English as a first language. On any given day, they have to be able to use 3 to 5 different mobile apps. They have a blueprint technology app they have to use. They have a safety technology app they have to use. They have to use a mobile app. We're subcontractors on a building job. We want to submit a work order change to the general contractor. And so even, these are not folks who are running the job site, right? The company I interviewed told me, look, some of our guys are on jobs that are 2-person jobs that last a week. And some of our guys are on jobs that are on, 200 worker jobs that last 2 years. Either way, they have to be comfortable using these technologies. And they said, we sub for 30 different general contractors. Across those 30 different general contractors, they use 5 or 6 different apps for managing work orders and important changes, right? So we also came across some really interesting data on the growing use of cobots or collaborative robots. The price of these things has dropped dramatically. And so small manufacturers, they would perhaps not have bought a robot a few years ago when it cost $1 million. Now the robot costs $180,000. It's much more something that an employer is willing to consider. And what that does is it changes the worker's job, because now the robot is doing the heavy repetitive part of the work, and the worker has to be available to work alongside and troubleshoot the robot. And I'll share another example of that in a second. Telehealth, we particularly see this in communities that have rural or aging populations. I know that Vermont, like my home state of Pennsylvania, absolutely has an aging population. A lot of medical reception desk staff, pre-pandemic, they would be in the doctor's office checking people in person. And then when the pandemic hit, they suddenly became troubleshooters, helping elderly or disabled patients figure out how to log on and access telehealth apps. And frankly, also supporting doctors and nurses and care providers in figuring out how to use the telehealth apps, right? So those are paraprofessional jobs that maybe didn't have digital skills at the forefront before, but really do now. Greenhouse workers, I know in your fellow New England states, greenhouse industry is a real phenomenon. I don't know to what extent that's something you see in Brattleboro, but there's increasingly technology even in these environments that we think of as very ag focused and not so much about technology. This is a real photo from a real plant. This is a meat packing plant. The worker here is a 62-year-old woman named Marisol. She doesn't speak English as her first language. She didn't go past high school. And her job used to be lifting 40-pound boxes of frozen meat. Her job is now supervising the cobot that lifts the 40-pound boxes of frozen meat. And she has become the troubleshooter in her plant. And she's the one that figured out that sometimes when the robot doesn't lift the box, it's because there's too much air in the box and the robot thinks the box is empty, right? And so you can see that even in this plant, we think of meat packing as being cold, messy work. There are 3 kinds of technology in this picture, right? On the left-hand side, you see the woman holding the tablet. On the blue table in the middle there, you see the handheld scanner. And then on the right-hand side, you see the screen, which is the HMI, the human machine interface, managing the cobot. So, those examples I just lifted up to emphasize the degree to which even entry-level positions now require digital skills. And that is backed up in our data. When we looked at those 43 million help wanted ads, even jobs looking for folks with 0 to 2 years of experience overwhelmingly required digital skills. That's the line that's circled in red here. And even jobs that require a high school diploma or an associate's degree as their highest level of education still overwhelmingly require digital skills. So hopefully this is data that's backing up some things you're seeing in real life and already thinking about with Skill Lab and the other initiatives that you're overseeing, but it gives some content and solidity and some numbers behind the phenomenon that you may have been hearing about. We hear a lot about assumptions about age and technology. Our research, and I did 45 qualitative interviews as well as all the quantitative data analysis that we did, So I talked to a lot of people, and there are two assumptions that are wrong. So the first assumption is it's wrong to assume that older workers aren't comfortable with technology. There are a lot of older workers who are actually quite fluent and comfortable with technology and ready to mentor younger and other workers. But it's also incorrect to assume that all younger workers are digital natives and definitely comfortable with technology. What we see in younger workers is what we see in workers of every age. They have fragmented knowledge. They could be great at making a TikTok video or sending a text message. That does not mean they're going to be great at managing the cobot or figuring out how to navigate an electronic health record. So what's the implication for workforce development? Again, it goes back to those two principles from the beginning. People need to learn in real world context that connects to the way they're actually going to use technology on the job. And people need opportunities to build from the skills they have to the new skills they need. And so again, it's less about which credential people are acquiring and more about having a really clear conversation with employers and hiring managers to have a good sense of what skills people are going to need to use on the job and making sure to close the feedback loop between the workforce development program or the community college or education program and the employer needs, so that you're not having that problem that you described with the folks trained in the heat pump, where it's like, okay, we're all trained in this whole technology, and then it turns out actually the employer is not hiring for that skill at the moment. We also found pretty definitively in our research that jobs that require even one definitely digital skill pay on average 23% more than jobs that require no digital skills. So helping people build these digital skills really is part of helping them achieve greater economic mobility. Obviously, depending on cost of living, these numbers could look different. These are national numbers, so I'm not suggesting they'd be exactly the same in Vermont, but just giving you a sense generally. We also looked at, okay, well, is this really just a phenomenon of big companies, right? Is it just big companies that are digitizing and small employers really aren't? So we don't have an exact way to get at this in the data, but we did look at the volume of job ads that a business was posting. If you posted between 1 and 50 job openings a year, your demand for digital skills is pretty close to bigger companies that post 500 or more job openings a year. So there's a little difference, but it's not a huge difference. Now, you can get much smaller, right? We were not able to look at, for example, people who post only 1 to 10 job openings a year, and the numbers might go down a little bit more if we did that. But I have a great slide that I don't have in this presentation that I took in a tiny little grocery store in a not very wealthy neighborhood in Philadelphia. And it's this little handwritten index card for a 2-person medical office. And they are hiring a 3rd staffer. And it says in handwritten notes, computer skills required. It's like, okay, sometimes even these 2 or 3 person, little businesses still need somebody with digital skills. We also found in our data that people need both foundational and industry-specific skills. And I'm going to talk about what that means in a minute. But basically, the take-home message of this slide is it is not sufficient to just park people in a Microsoft Office class and call it a day. You can't just be like, okay, everybody's learned this basic Microsoft Office thing, you're good to go. People really do need opportunities to build digital skills that are relevant to the industry or the specific occupation that they're going to be working in. So let's go back to some Vermont-specific data. And here I will be honest and say, you know this, Vermont is a small state. The volume of job postings in Vermont is more modest than we would see in a state with a larger population. So it's important to not overemphasize any one nugget of data, but hopefully this can give you at least a kind of bird's eye view of some of the things that show up over and over again in job ads. So the first one is very straightforward. Nothing on here will be a surprise, right? These are very basic foundational skills that are, frankly, I could show you this slide for most states in the country and it would look quite similar. these are the baseline skills. They show up over and over and over and over again across every industry, every level of job category. Industry-specific skills, there's some more differences here. These are not necessarily ones that you would see, Vermont's data, and I've done these presentations for a lot of states. Vermont's data doesn't look exactly like every other state's in this respect. Obviously, it's not a surprise that in the healthcare sector, electronic medical records show up. It's probably not a surprise to see older technology like CNC, or computer numerical control in manufacturing. We did see really high demand, and I was a little surprised by this, for enterprise resource planning software like SAP's ERP software in the manufacturing sector. My guess is if we dug a little deeper in the Vermont data, we'd see ERP software in other industries too, but I didn't want to go down to too small a universe of job postings because I was worried that one employer might like really swing the numbers one direction or another. Public administration, Vermont is a state like most states in which one of the larger employers is local government and state government. So you can see a couple of pieces of software that are pretty popular there. And retail, I was a little surprised, but Vermont is similar to a number of states where SAS retail analytics and consumer goods software is in more demand. I wouldn't necessarily have, it's not the case for every state with a pretty robust rural population that retail has so much demand for digital skills, but Vermont was more like that than others. And I don't know whether that's because you have more national chains or fewer national chains in terms of your retail environment. You would know better than I do. So those are some of the industry specific skills that we see. I'm going to pause there and just see if you have questions about any of that data before I share just a little bit about some of the new federal funding that's coming that might be complementary to the work that you're doing with Skill Lab and other work. I'd love to hear reflections, skepticism, questions, ideas.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, this is great because, our work is then like medical coding is a great example is, there are two major employers and only two generally, who we could really set the pace in terms of like, well, what medical coding systems do they actually use? And so, where I think the rubber meets the road for us is continuing down the start, like which of our major manufacturers do use ERP systems? Is it really in high demand in our region? And CNC, CNC, a lot of the CNC stuff is driven by places other in the state because we have food manufacturing. So I think that great example is that, like, you know we'll bring this information to the employers who we work most closely with and say, does this sound right to you? And then
Right.
maybe one of them will say, oh no, actually we need everyone in food manufacturing needs a label maker. Like, anyway, so I think that, there's nothing sitting that's like wrong on first blush. I definitely think it's still up to us to kind of reaffirm the sector specific skills and really pick and choose which ones we would offer in a sector specific training versus like a generalized digital literacy isn't actually what we're like. Those foundational skills I don't think is what we're planning to provide. I think there's other providers in our region who we can tell them, hey, you can do foundational and we'll do sector specific. And I think that actually provides us better language in kind of directing our partners in what's um, feasible, doable. It shouldn't cost a lot of money to provide foundational skills training. It may, we would rather spend our grant funds on finding an expert on the local ERP system, right? And I think making sure that we can talk about that effectively, and can't wait to share this recording with our other partners to say, like, this is a great way to understand digital skills, but also to divide and conquer and making sure folks are getting it all without us being the provider of it. Unless you've got $1 million, another $1 million for us in the next slide, then we can do this all day and night and we'll do whatever. But I don't think we're actually in looking for any more federal grants right now. But yeah, excited to hear what's next.
Great. just want to give anybody else a chance to hop in if there's any clarifications or questions. Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay. All right. So I just want to give you a kind of very quick thumbnail here about some federal funding that's coming to Vermont. And the reason I'm doing this is because this money is coming through the U.S. Department of Commerce. It is not coming through the U.S. Department of Labor or the U.S. Department of Education. And so because it's coming through Commerce, at the state level, I have not had a recent conversation with your state broadband folks. And so you may all have had more recent conversations than I have, or you may hop off of this call and want to go have conversations with them. Alex, did you want to jump in
So,
here?
yeah, so our challenge, which we have met with them, I've met with the digital equity officer who's in charge of deploying the equity funds through that broadband initiative. We've connected, and I will say that because of our population, the focus as of right now is on creating access for elderly non-working populations, which again is important, but not relevant to the needs of working Vermonters, which unfortunately is kind of how things shake out. But so we're connected with them. I'm hoping that they see the work we're doing as an opportunity to invest. But yeah.
Well, let me just stipulate right now, I'm going to talk about a couple different pots of money. You should be aware there will be federal discretionary grants that will be opening up for applications in mid 2024. You can apply directly to the feds for those as a local government entity or as a nonprofit organization. You do not have to go through your state. So in addition to the federal funds that your state is dispensing, there's also a separate pot that the feds themselves will be dispensing. And if you decided that you wanted to pursue those, there's a list of 8 covered populations under the Digital Equity Act. Aging individuals over the age of 60 are one, but so are rural residents, veterans, people of color, people with low and moderate incomes, people with disabilities, English language learners, is a whole laundry list of folks. So even if you don't get any money, even if you don't get a penny from your state folks, you are still eligible to apply directly to the feds if you want to. Okay. So this is from the big infrastructure bill, the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that passed a couple of years ago in Congress. And that bill had about $40 billion nationwide for the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, and just under $3 billion for the Digital Equity Act. And again, this money is overseen by Commerce. And I mention that because I have talked extensively with the federal folks in Commerce. They are great folks. They would be the first to tell you they are not workforce or even economic development professionals, right? That is not their bailiwick. And so there's a lot of kind of education that is happening to help them understand. So, Vermont is going to get about $228 million in BEAD funding from the feds. And that BEAD funding gets used for several different purposes. And I've kind of outlined those purposes on the slide here. But the most important is that Vermont will be eligible to spend some of that money on what's called non-deployment uses, including workforce development. Now, it's possible that because of the rural nature of the state and the infrastructure needs, there won't be a lot of money left over for non-deployment, but I wanted to make sure that you had that information, right? So this is the allocation. This is direct from the feds. We know for a fact Vermont will be getting $228 million in BEAD funding. Most of the money will get spent on what's called last mile deployment, right? Getting broadband to people who don't have it at all, or who only have slow or spotty internet access right now, and getting it to community anchor institutions, which the feds have defined that, but states also have the ability to add more types of institutions to the list, schools, libraries, community colleges. Some states have added hospitals and other, And this money, this last mile money, can be used for cybersecurity professionals and for workforce development uses. So I'm putting that on the slide here just as a reminder if and when you have further conversations with your state partners. And then again, if there's money left over after last mile deployment, you also have the ability to spend non-deployment on this longer list of activities. Now, again, it may be the case that that's, you know, a non-starter in Vermont for whatever reason, but I wanted you to have at least this, you know, these are federal guidelines. I put the footnotes here so you know where they're coming from, about all the ways that this money can be used and how it can flexibly support a whole range of initiatives for working adults, and particularly upskilling and reskilling. And then the 5-year action plan that Vermont has submitted to the feds is a public document. If you haven't already seen it, I can send you a link to it, and you can see sort of what's been described there. But they're on the hook. The feds have every state on the hook to explain, hey, what's your workforce plan for making sure that there are workers who can install all of this new broadband internet and so forth. So that in and of itself is also a workforce development, you know, project. And some states, I will tell you right now, I'm working on a set of rather grouchy comments to one large state who should know better, whose workforce plan in their BEAD plan is very sketchy and thin. And there are other states that are really robust. You know, Illinois has been very thorough, for example, in how they're approaching this. Okay.
Yeah, that's something
Yeah.
that's like a concern of mine because, you know, at that meeting, so, you know, a side note is, you know, our utility company, Green Mountain Power, has promised every Vermonter a battery and gave us funds to help ensure that new Vermonters and refugees can help install those batteries, right? And so at a meeting with the broadband equity group and the folks managing the BEAD funds, I said, by the way, there's no reason we can't look at fiber optic installation. And they kind of made it sound like they had already thought of that and had it covered, but I know for a fact that it hasn't been thought about critically. And so I think that that's you know, I'm not expecting that partnership, but I also feel like it seemed really thin. Also, just like how they're going to lay the cables that eventually people will be able to use for, you know, digital access. So I think that's a whole other thing.
Yeah. And again, part of this is also sort of your appetite and your bandwidth, no pun intended, for, you know, how much you want to be nipping at the state's heels and kind of pushing them to be more specific. I will say, again, you know, states are kind of all over the map in the level of sophistication of the workforce plans. In some states, they're kind of throwing up their hands and saying, you know, we're going to leave this to the internet service providers to figure out, which I think is going to come back to bite them. But in other states like Illinois, they've been planning for well over a year, and they've been saying, okay, not only are we talking to our higher education institutions and our private training schools about, you know, who are they training and what skills do those folks have, but we're also imagining that we're going to end up training some workers who go elsewhere to work, right? And I don't know to what extent Vermont will end up either, you know, borrowing workers from Massachusetts or Maine to come do some work, or the extent to which you may be exporting some workers from Vermont to your neighboring New England states to do work. I will say there are some really cool models of a couple of places around the country, including one at a sheriff's office in Louisiana, where they did fiber optic technician training for folks who were currently incarcerated but soon to be released. And it was a partnership between a community college, the sheriff's department that oversaw the correctional facility, and an employer, because they just did not have enough headcount in terms of workers. And they were like, hallelujah, please train some new workers for us, right? There's another example in Alaska where a group of the nonprofit Fiber Optic Association is just, it's a trade association that does their credential for fiber optic technicians. And they trained a group of women, many of whom were indigenous, to be doing installations on tribal land and, you know, overseeing that. So there's some really cool workforce development models for training folks to do this work. And if that is something you want to get deeper into at any point, I'm happy to put you in touch with folks who are doing that. Okay, so Digital Equity Act funding. There's two pots of money. There's formula funding that will go through your state and get dispensed down to local level. And I think, Alex, that's the money you were talking about, that maybe there's a focus on elder Vermonters with that money. But then there's also these federal discretionary competitive grants that you can apply directly for. And the list of entities that apply directly for that federal competitive grant include any unit of local government, any nonprofit organization that is providing a workforce development program, and a couple of other categories. So I'm 100% sure you would qualify if you wanted to go after the competitive grant money. So if you decide that you did want to do that, it could cover either foundational or industry-specific digital skills. The phrase they use in the law is actually basic, advanced, or applied digital skills, but it's the same general principle. This is the list of covered populations under the Digital Equity Act. These are the ones I ran through before. I'm really just giving this to you as reference. And these are the lists of entities who are eligible to apply directly to the feds for this competitive grant funding. And as I just mentioned, I think you would fall under at least one, if not two of these categories. What can this funding be used for? There's a kind of laundry list of things you can use the money for, but the one that's important here is highlighted in green. And again, there's quite a bit of flexibility here in terms of what kinds of digital skills you might be teaching people. Okay, so just very briefly, making sure that you're familiar with the BEAD and digital equity plans are helpful. We know what helps people build digital skills, right? Contextualized learning, industry recognized credentials when credentials are important. This is a report I did a couple of years ago after having interviewed a bunch of businesses about how they're helping workers upskill. If you want to dig deeper, the link to that report is in here. If it's appropriate, you might want to support broadband apprenticeship or other earn and learn opportunities. Bring together employer partners, as you're already doing, to help inform workforce programs, and then really embedding digital skill building within existing programs like incumbent worker training. Most people don't learn stuff well in isolation. And I'll give you an example from one of your fellow New England states. Early in the pandemic, the company Coursera decided, we're going to give 5,000 free licenses for online learning to any unemployed person, right? And they did that in a bunch of different states. And in one state, the state sent an email to somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 unemployed, people who'd filed for unemployment insurance, and said, hey, listen, while you're sitting at home on lockdown and unemployed, here's an online learning platform you might, find useful to use. Of the 300,000+ people who got that email, 16,000 people ended up creating an account with Coursera. Of the 16,000 people who created an account with Coursera, 8,000 people took even one session of one class on Coursera. And of the 8,000 people who took even one class on Coursera, between 7% and 46% actually completed the class that they had signed up for, right? So the class might have had 6 sessions or 12 sessions or 15 sessions or whatever, right? And I tell you that to say, most humans don't learn well by just parking them in front of a computer and giving them a link to an online class and saying, do this completely on your own. Most people, even if they're doing online learning, they do a lot better if they have some coaching and some peer support and just a human sounding board to help them make sense of the online resources that they are being confronted with. And so when we think about incumbent worker training and helping folks upskill from an entry-level position to a higher level position, one of the ways employers can do that effectively is have there be some kind of peer support within the company of like, we're all going to take this online course together and we're going to meet, once a week or once a month to discuss what we're learning in the course. And that is actually a best practice in helping people stay engaged and persist in learning. Yeah.
What's so interesting and a lead to a question I have is that our organization also is the point organization for our Vermont training program, which is a
Mm,
statewide employer driven training program where it subsidizes half the cost of an employer to do incumbent worker training. I would say 90% of all the grants we've given out were around digital workplace skills. And so what's
mm.
unique is that it's the employers who have identified it pretty explicitly. It's what they're asking for. Like, they know if we're upgrading our system, we're going to need to do an all staff training. How do we do it? They throw it all in. This leads to my next question is I cannot for the life of me understand which agency thinks they're responsible for digital literacy because it's not adult education, it's not workforce, it's not commerce. Is there a state that you've identified that like has really said, yep, no, it's an adult skill and this is the agency who's in charge of making sure our folks have it, or no?
So Colorado's Office of the Future of Work
They're
is
so good at everything.
a one-woman shop, but she's amazing. And she's very tied into their adult education partners, their community college system, and their workforce development system. So if you haven't already talked to Catherine Keegan, she's their director of the Office of Future of Work. She has a really good bird's eye view of this stuff. And I think she's done a really nice job. Another good person to talk to is Marilyn Pizzullo in Indiana. Marilyn used to be the state director of adult education. Then she got promoted. Her job now is like director of governor's workforce strategy or something like that. She sits within the Department of Workforce Development in the state, which is their labor agency, but their adult ed universe is underneath her still. So she still
Mm,
supervises that. And Maryland is interesting because Indiana has experimented with some really tailored outreach, where, for example, they look at their UI claims recipients, they see what industries people were most recently employed in, what education level they have, and then they send a tailored outreach to them saying, hey, we see that you haven't yet completed your high school education. If you want to get a GED or high school equivalency, here's our state adult ed program that you could sign up for, right? Or, hey, we see that you have a high school diploma, but might want to do some further education. Did you know about Indiana's Next Level Jobs Initiative, which is their skills-based short-term credentials that are sub-baccalaureate and most cases sub-associate degree level, credentials. So Marilyn is a good person to talk to for being kind of a good bird's eye perspective, thinking about digital skills embedded within adult ed and workforce development. Um, thinking about other states, honestly, the municipal level in a couple of states is better than some of the
mm,
state level. So for example, David Key in Seattle is amazing. He's just a legend in the field, an interesting person to talk to. Rebecca Coma, who used to be in Long Beach, California, and who just moved over to Los Angeles, is really interesting. But there's also people in St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Paul, obviously, it's still not a geographic equivalent to Southern Vermont, I recognize. But talking to Eric Nisheim at Literacy Minnesota might be a good plan. Eric was very creative early in the pandemic using CARES Act money and then using ARPA money, American Rescue Plan Act money, to do some really creative partnerships around digital skills between Literacy Minnesota as an adult ed provider and their local workforce board, I
mm.
think it's Hennepin County, I can't remember. And I just flagged that to say, again, thinking about incumbent worker training or adult ed, or sort of where does digital upskilling live? Eric is also, his organization is also the people behind the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment. They're the ones who developed North Star, if you're familiar with that. So North Star is a pretty well-known foundational digital skills credential that folks use to kind of indicate that they have some very basic baseline, digital skills. So, those are some people I might talk to. The folks in San Antonio, Texas are doing interesting work. There are other folks in smaller cities that might also be useful to talk to. the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has a Digital Trailblazer Awards section on their website, and I can send you the link to that. It might be useful for you because you might know better than I do if there are kind of peer cities to Brattleboro that you look at always as models. You could just check the Trailblazers list to see if any of those peer cities are showing up.
Great. Yeah, I mean, again, this Colorado thing, I mean, they have their Office of New Americans that lives in their labor department. You know, I don't know about their outcomes, but it's clear that they're thinking across agency for a number of their different initiatives, which like, again, they always have these funky names of offices that it's like, I think like, especially in the Vermont context, like why are there these huge siloed agencies for such a small population? Like we must be able to collaborate more effectively between partners and agencies. And the irony being Colorado, I think, is the standard in a number of different ways on how to organize government around that. And that my question is because like our labor and agency of education and commerce departments still fight each other over who is responsible for workforce development. And then you say, okay, well, great. So who's going to fund adult digital literacy in the workplace? And then it's crickets, because everyone wants to take credit for it, but no one wants to be the funders of it. And so I think that's just good context. So I really appreciate that.
I should also say, I've been jumping up and down and screaming at Congress about this for several years now. Even in the Federal Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Title II, adult education, has one buried reference to digital skills as an allowable activity. And we have been pushing hard in the WIOA reauthorization that Congress is very slowly starting to discuss to say, hey guys, you need to be very explicit. The digital skills should be embedded all the way across Titles 1, 2, Wagner Pfizer, Voc Rehab. Like it should be everywhere. You should not just be like parking it 3 layers deep in an adult ed allowable activity.
Well, that's fantastic because first of all, where our Title II dollars goes is also different than most states. It's like a third party adult literacy provider who are great, we're partnered with, but like once it gets that convoluted and separate from the adult workforce system from the workplace perspective, it's just really hard to like affect change. And like if digital literacy is not a priority in our region's office, then it's really hard for them to get any more funding. Um, and so that is one thing. And then also the other reason why we know we need to put our federal labor funds towards digital literacy is because our state Department of Labor was really only willing to support one training. And then they said, well, that's it. But because it's not a WIOA eligible expense as of today.
Yeah, and see, this is the thing. I have this argument with the feds all the time. They say, well, it's allowed. And I'm like, the states think that if you haven't explicitly spelled out that it's allowed, then it must be forbidden. Whereas, the feds are like, well, if we haven't explicitly forbidden it, then it must be
Yeah.
allowed. I'm like,
Or like
that's
what,
not how people read it.
and in Vermont, we're stuck on what is a credential of value. And so if this North Star is considered a credential of value, then it's fundable. And if it's not, then it isn't. And it's like semantic in some of those ways. Like we can all agree the skill sets are in demand and of value, but it's just, yeah, it's really tricky.
Well, I will send you then one other thing that some of my colleagues have worked on, which might be affirming to you. So we did a project with 6 states to look at how do you assess quality in non-degree credentials. So I will send that along. I know we're close to time here.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you one last thing. Let me share a screen here. So I just dropped a link to a blog post into the chat. And the reason I dropped that in was there's a couple of cool links in this blog post. So the first one is Hawaii did this beautiful digital equity ecosystem map. And I'm going to see if I can pull that up for you. But the other is that North Carolina is the only state in the country, as far as I know, where they have 18 local digital equity plans at the county level that are then feeding up and informing the state digital equity plan. So the North Carolina folks might be interesting for you to talk to at some point if you haven't already made contact with them. And again, I've linked to just about everything in this blog post, but if you don't have a link to something and you want to find it, please do let me know. I'm going to see if I can find the Hawaii ecosystem map just before we hop off the phone here, because I think it's a beautiful illustration.
Yeah. And it didn't take me long to assess that of course, our regional planning commission, because we don't have county government. So that's the other thing. It's like our regional planning commission has not referenced digital equity explicitly. It seems in their history, Googleable history. So maybe that's something to think about, but not hold our breath for.
Yeah, and again, you're always going to know your local landscape the best, right? You know where the energy is. I work in some communities where it's like, well, the United Way is where everything happens, or the Chamber of Commerce is where everything happens, or the Rotary Club is what everything runs through, or you go out to Utah, it's like, well, the LDS Church is running everything. I'm like, really, guys? Separation of church and state? Not really a thing. So like you're going to know where the energy is in your community and who are the
Yep.
doers, who are kind of focusing and getting stuff done. So, that is, okay, here it is. Here's Hawaii's map. I'm going to share a screen before we hop off here. Just for the heck of it, because it's so beautiful what they did. Okay. So they made this extremely local by using not just concepts from ancient indigenous Hawaiian culture, but language from Hawaii today. And so this is their map, and it gets even more detailed than this. But it's sort of like, okay, what is the digital equity ecosystem, right? Digital equity is the sun, access is oxygen, internet service providers are clouds. But then, all these things that both create barriers or create opportunity. And so it's a very rich map that was developed with all of this community input and conversation. And, and then there's some very blunt, like, here's why it's not working well, right? We have unreliable internet in rural communities. There's lack of digital literacy skills. Internet is expensive, right? And so this kind of community visioning process can actually be really helpful in creating that vision that we talked about in Colorado and other states, where it's like, okay, are we looking across agencies to figure out where this cross-cutting issue can and should live? Or is everybody just throwing up their hands and saying, kind of not my problem? So I will drop the Hawaii map link into the chat too before we hop off here. So you have my contact information in the slides, but I'm going to put it in the chat here too. I'm always happy to hop on and be part of another conversation. If you all have partners you want to bring into this, if you get deeper into your skill lab work and have updates. Jennifer, did you want to?
Yeah, this is really great. I took a lot of notes. This is super helpful. I'll look at the report you did. It's so great. And I wanted to ask you, is there any reason why we wouldn't start with that Northern Lights sort of framework and curriculum as we sort of, obviously needing to be sensitive? I mean, we're an economic development organization. We're pretty sensitive to who the employers are here. So, but I mean, is there any reason for that not to be a starting point for us?
So the only reason that North Star wouldn't be where you start is if you wanted to start instead with the IC3 curriculum, and I forget now exactly what that stands for. IC3 is an internationally developed standard, and it's basically I can't even call it the main competitor to North Star because they're a little bit different. North Star is great because you can go to their website and you can take a practice assessment yourself and just see how it works. The major knock that we normally hear about North Star, to the extent that anybody complains about it, is they feel like it's a little elementary. And IC3 is a little more sophisticated. They're both foundational skills measures, but IC3 is a little more sophisticated.
Okay.
So
okay. So what I've been able to learn is, our local Brattleboro Vermont Adult Learning does the assessments, will issue certificates but will not offer computer classes, but does not offer the actual North Star class. So I think from a digital literacy assessment standpoint, it is being used by our local partners, which is great until they're assessed at not having the skills that they need, and then there's no real way to shore up those skill gaps. So I think
Okay.
maybe that's a conversation to talk with Matt, is that if they already have a relationship with North Star, how do we juice that
Sure.
and let them do that? Especially because we don't want to be the foundational training providers either way.
The other thing I will just say is there's a wonderful federal initiative that I am part of called Digital, I'm an informal advisor on it, Resilience in the American Workforce, or DRAW. And basically the value of the DRAW initiative is it's a federally funded research project that has pulled together a bunch of basically literature reviews, and here are 6 assessments. Here are the pros and cons to each of the 6 assessments. Here are 6 curricula. Here are the pros and cons to the different curricula. So it's kind of like someone has done your homework for you in terms of being able to get a sense. Now they focused on the foundational digital skills, not on the industry or sector specific skills. But their briefs are really easy to read, very accessible, and super well, linked and footnoted. So I'll email you the DRAW. I'm going to make myself a note to send the DRAW resources when I send my follow-up email to you.
Great.
And I'll send you also the quality non-degree credential report in case that's a thing you want to go deeper on. Okay. Any other questions or reactions? I'm also always happy to hear skepticism. So once you have a chance to digest this information, if you look at it and you're like, that doesn't really jibe with my experience or what I'm seeing, please feel free to let me know.
This is excellent. I think the only, if anything, what will be reinforced is that statewide data often pollutes hyper-regional data, but
Yeah.
that isn't anything you don't know about, and it's not your fault. It's it's why we're part of the Chamber of Commerce Town Pipeline. It's why we do the Skill Lab, and it's why we just like walk into our employers and ask them what's actually happening. So,
Yeah.
but again, this is exactly, we know what to test. We know the questions to ask of our employers to design a thing. Yeah, no, this was exactly what I was hoping for. So I really appreciate your time on this.
I'm really glad I was able to be helpful, and please don't hesitate to reach back out if there are more questions or you get deeper into this and want to talk to some folks in other parts of the country that I can connect you to.
Great.
All right.
Great.
Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Appreciate your time. Take care.